In this video, I wanted to create a beginner-friendly walkthrough when it comes to responsive web design. Some topics that I'll be touching will be media queries, Flexbox, grid system, templates, and frameworks. When websites were first being developed, they were being developed for certain screen sizes in mind, but as technology has advanced and most of us have tablets, cell phones, smartwatches, devices on our refrigerators, we have to make sure that our apps, our websites are compatible for these different screen sizes. So that's where the responsive web design does come in. Hopefully in this video, it will allow you and I to be more comfortable with approaching the front end development side and making sure that our sites do respond the way that we want it to when it is being viewed on certain screen sizes. So let's go ahead and get started. I will be recreating a responsive site, and one of my primary resources will be W3 Schools. I feel W3 Schools is really great on documentation, especially when it comes to demos and examples. I feel like they're really clear and easy to follow, and it's really beginner friendly. But even if you're an expert dev, I feel like there's a lot of things that you can learn from that site and a lot of things that you forgot about to refresh yourself on. So that's what I'll be referencing throughout this video. And let me go ahead and pull up the example. So here's an example of a site here that I have that's built with responsiveness in mind. And this is just a really basic one-page site. It's about a couple. Top, I have a nav bar that just pretty much links to pictures on the same page. I have my header section here, which just has like an about me. And if you scroll down, these are where those links take you to, is just pictures of them. And then at the bottom, I just have a footer, and there's just a quote and also just some credit about, who made the site, W3 Schools, and myself. So since this site is about being responsive, if I change the type of device that we're on, then we'll see that the layout changes. So here, as the screen gets smaller, we can see that the layout of our website changes. And I'm actually just going to change this to a phone. And we can see that our nav bar at the top changed and our links are now in more of like a little compact, clickable form. And then we can also see that our sections are now stacked on each other, where the image is stacked underneath text. And then instead of 4x4 with our pictures, we just have like one single column of each of them. So that is the whole point, is that we want to be able to change how our site looks, that it still looks good on whatever device that we're looking at the site from. And this template, this was a template that I actually just got off of W3 Schools, and this is what it originally kind of looked like. So I did a little bit of changing and I left most of the colors there, but I wanted to just focus more on the responsiveness of front-end dev. When it comes to development, there are different ways to accomplish the same thing. So when it comes to making your site responsive, there's different ways to approach this. And you're going to have best practices, and you're also going to have things that you will see are your preference. It's really going to depend on what the purpose is of your site. Is it a blog page? Is it a shopping page? Just depending on what your site is meant to do is going to just give you more insight on how you want to lay your site out. So on the screen, I have a visual of just a representation of how the screen size is divided out, and commonly it's divided out into 12 columns. And it doesn't matter if it's a desktop or if it's a mobile phone, it's still going to be 12 columns. And you pretty much can lay out content by taking up so much amount of those columns. So if you had maybe two div boxes, you may have one div take up 6 out of those 12 columns, and that second div is going to take up the other 6. Now, if you had those divs take up 4 columns each, where they only equaled 8, and now you have 4 columns left over, all you will see is just white space next to those two divs. So in the example at the bottom, you can see depending on how this site is supposed to be built, they have different divs that take up certain amount of columns. You know, Nav Bar would take up 12. This section on the left might be some type of links or content where it only takes up 3. And then maybe you have some featured news on the right where it's going to only take up 3. Then you just have to make sure that you have space that's not taking up center columns, and then you have a footer at the bottom also taking up 12. So that's one way for you to visually see where you can place your content. So when it comes to the grid view, the columns take up 12 columns, and that's going to be 100% of a screen size. So if you were to make your own divs and you wanted to create them of all different columns, you would want to do those calculations to equal 100%. If you did not, then there will be white spaces left on your website, and depending on what type of device you are using, you know, the website can behave a way that you didn't expect it to do. So in this example, which comes from W3 Schools, there are 12 different classes that represent how much space the div will take up. So if I created a div and I wanted that div class to be column 12, that div is automatically just going to take up 12 columns. It's going to be 100% of my screen size. Now, if I wanted to make 2 different divs and say I wanted one div to be smaller than the other and maybe next to each other, then I would make one div class and I could name it column 3. It doesn't have to be named this way, but it makes sense. But column 3, and I would do the calculation for this div to take up only, say, 3 columns. And that would be 25% of the 100% width on the screen. And then my second div will take up the remainder. So 100 minus 25 is 75. So they'll take up the 75% of the screen. And 75, that could be 9 columns. 3 plus 9 is 12. So hopefully, if you are creating your own classes for your divs, hopefully this is a good reference for you to know what type of calculations you can put in here for each class. And again, if the classes that you use don't equal 100%, you will be left with white space. With the grid view, you still are going to have 12 columns that still take up the width even on a mobile screen or on a desktop screen. As you can see, if you were going to a smaller screen size, the content is still within its columns, but depending on what type of content was in here, I'm sure it wouldn't look very clean or readable on smaller screen sizes. So that's why we would look at other methods to be able to shift our content around when we're viewing on smaller screen sizes or even making things disappear. Based on the device we're using, or even the browser, if I'm using Safari or Firefox instead of Chrome, how am I going to target certain elements on my website to respond differently? You know, if it's a small device, do I want things to go away? Do I want things to move around? And the way that we do that is by using media queries. And media queries pretty much allows us to apply certain styling to our elements depending on the device properties that we are targeting. So here I wanted to go through a quick example from W3 Schools to explain more about the media queries. So here I have 4 divs and they're all taking up 3 columns each because we're doing that 12 column grid view. So if my screen was on a, say, mobile phone, then all these 4 columns would be compact and they would still all be in a row, and probably all this text would look really squished and crammed together and unreadable. So instead, what I would want those columns to do is shift around when it's on a smaller screen size. So when I get maybe to more of like a tablet screen size, then I want the columns to stack in like a 4x4. Then maybe if I'm on a mobile phone or smaller than that, then I would want those columns to just maybe stack on top of each other. So instead of that screen size being this size, and we have all 4 of those columns jammed horizontally, we can use media queries to look at the screen size and move these columns around. We can even put the column 4 as column 1 instead with just our CSS properties. So creating media queries is really easy. There's styling that is going to be a part of your other CSS styling in the styling sheet. And what you do is you just do add media and you include the media type. In this example, it's this media type screen, and then an expression. You don't have to include an expression, but in this sense, we're saying we want the screen to be max 400. So screen sizes that are less than 400, we are going to make the body color blue. If the screen size is over 400, then the body color is going to be whatever we have that set as, if it's set as something. So real quick, I just wanted to show the example again where the 4 divs are stacked on top of each other. And these 4 divs are wrapped inside a parent div called row. And the media query that is changing this behavior on the screen size is saying that on screen size less than 600, we're going to target the row div and apply the flex direction column property to it. And that column property is what is going to automatically stack the divs against each other as such. And there's other types of responsive property that you can use instead of flex. You can use the grid properties as well. Flex is one dimensional, and grid is 2-dimensional. And those are the differences between them, where they're similar, but they're different. They're like fraternal twins. When it comes to you choosing between using Flexbox properties or grid properties for your responsive design, it does just depend on what type of site you're making. Usually more complex sites that have divs that need to move around a little bit more, or maybe are in odd places, you would use a grid system. If you have a layout that's more straightforward and maybe not doing too much, then the Flexbox would be just as valuable. In the video, I'm going to be using another method for responsive design, and that's by using a template. And the template is just going to pretty much give me a skeleton of a layout, and from there I can build off of that. So before we jump into developing our site off of a template, I do want to mention developer.mozilla.org as a place of reference. This place is definitely great for documentation and some visuals. It's a little bit more technical, but I feel like it will give you some great insight on choosing between Flexbox or Grid if you don't know which properties to use, but it will definitely steer you in the right direction on getting more familiar with laying out your website. So I will be referencing W3 schools when it comes to building my site off of their template. There's other resources that you can use that are great, like Bootstrap, Foundation, Material UI. I feel like those are a little bit more advanced, and I'm using W3 Schools because I feel like it's more beginner friendly and basic to get comfortable with responsive design and styling and classes. So from the home page, I'm going to go to the Learn CSS section, and then I'm going to scroll down and go to the responsive section and then templates. And the template that I chose is more towards the middle. It's this one here, Start Page Template. So if you're following along, this will be the one that I'm using. You can play with or use the other ones at your liking. One thing that I do want to point out is there is another section called Frameworks. You can use the Framework section as well. Frameworks are going to give you more of the bare minimum of a layout. So there's just a lot more customization involved with the frameworks, whereas template is kind of like a furnished apartment. You know, everything's kind of already in place for you, and you kind of add and take as you please. So it really just depends on your comfort level, your website, different things as far as taking the framework approach, the template approach, or just simply doing straight out the gate Flexbox or grid system. So I'm just going to go ahead and create the project directory. You can use File Explorer to go ahead and get this set up. So in our fresh project file, we're not going to see anything because we don't have anything in here, but I'm just going to go ahead and tell you how to get the template that of your liking and get it set up here locally. So you can get the source code for this through the try it yourself or through the demo. Try it yourself, you know, let you play around with it. Demo is just the normal way the page looks. I'm just going to do the demo side, and I'm going to go into view page source, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy the entire source code. If you did the try it yourself, it's the same thing pretty much, but it just gives you that extraness. So I'm going to go back to my text editor, and I'm going to go ahead and paste all of that code into my file, and I should be able to see it. Okay, so I'm going to just verify that I can see this locally. All right, so we can see the site. So now that we have our template set up locally here, we need to get familiar with the styling that's in place. And W3 Schools is using their own styling sheet. Now, getting familiar with their styling, we'll be able to make changes and modify our website even further. But we don't only have to stick with their style sheet. We can actually incorporate our own styling to what's already existing as well to be even more creative. So returning to the W3 school documentation again, I just want to point out a section that in their Learn CSS and then the W3 CSS, this is a CSS framework that's being included in their templates. So in this section, this is going to give you all of the pre-made styling that they have set up. So all you have to do is just apply that class to whatever element you want to apply it to, and it will go ahead and do that styling for you, so you don't have to do it yourself. So this is really in handy when, in particular, if I go to the layout section and I can look at different classes that I can apply to my divs, you know, when it comes to how much div content I want to take up. There's a class that I could automatically apply to that, along with even colors and things like that. Now, you don't have to use their styling, you can use your own, but they have so much styling already created for you that all you need to do is just get more familiar with the class and what that class means and what it does. So back in our text editor, at the beginning of our script, our CSS is being called, and this is being called from a server on W3 Schools In, but we can actually look at all of the CSS styling ourselves. And if we wanted to host this styling locally, all we would have to do is copy this code and put it in our own file in our project. But we don't have to do that. We can still reference it the way that it's set up. But I do want to search for media because that's where that responsive design comes in when it comes to being on a cell phone or being on a tablet. Is they already have the classes set up for us based off of screen sizes. So all we have to do is apply that class, for example, like W3 column medium 1. All we need to do is apply that class to whatever element we want, and it will adjust accordingly. So as far as making this website our own, we just want to make some changes. I am going to skip past the nav section and the header section for now, and I'm going to focus on the two grid sections. So just because the comments say grid, it looks like they're using the grid styling. So what I want to do is make both sections in this grid to be text so we can see how the columns can change to our liking. So if we look at the layout of this template with the divs, we see that we have a div that's actually a row, because normally when you're doing any type of like responsive, you have some type of row or container to encompass all of the elements inside of it. So you consider that as the parent, and then everything inside it are its children. So we have this div class that is a row, and then we have some children divs inside of it. So the important one to look at is the div class that has our text, and the other div class that used to have our image that also has our text in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and save to see how this changed on our site. Okay. So as we can see, the text is not even. So what if we wanted for both the left and the right side to be equal? If we look at our class, we can see that the class is set up to show, here it says 2/3, whereas the second div is set to third. So being familiar with the classes and what they mean, this is saying that this first div is taking up 2/3 of the space, and that second div is going to take up 1/3 of the space. And if we look at our documentation, we're getting that information from here. So if we want it to be even, I'm going to change that class to say W3 half instead. in the second div, instead of 2/3 or a third, I'll say W3/2 there, and then that should make it even. Awesome, so now we have two even divs side by side. So let's say that we wanted to add another div in that section, that we need 3 sections for content. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy that div, and I'm going to paste it underneath so that we have 3 divs now in our first grid. I'm gonna save this and take a look at what it looks like. So it looks like nothing changed, but in fact, we can see that our third div is actually starting on the second row of the first row, of the first grid, I should say. And that's because our class, we already said that the first 2 divs are gonna take up 1/2 of the width, and the second div will take up the second half. So we will need to manipulate our first 2 divs to accommodate that third div if we want it to all be within the same row. So back in my text editor, I'm going to change the class to say quarter, because that's actually going to mean 1/4 of the page. And I'm going to use the last div, the third div that I added, and also make that one say quarter. And this should accommodate all my divs to be on the same row. So now we have all the divs on the same row. But what about the content inside it? The content is all different sizes. Let's even look at the content on a smaller screen and see what it does. We can see that it adjusts on a smaller screen, but on our larger screen size, we see that the content is all different sizes. So how do we adjust that to be in sync? So we need to still look more into our styling. And part of the reason I know why is because we copied and pasted some divs, and the divs were meant to do different things. So of course they're going to display differently. So if we go back and look at the 3 divs, we can see that one is set to quarter, one div is set up to be a half and also be in the center, and also another one is set up to be a quarter and in a center. So since we have div elements that are all that are set up to display a different amount of space on the screen, then of course the elements inside of it are going to be spaced out accordingly. So we would probably want to make our divs a little bit more equal so the content inside of it is also equal, or whatever other manipulations that we need to do. So I'm going to, on one of the child divs, I'm going to actually turn this into a third. And then on the one in the center, I'm going to turn that also into a third. And then in the one in this last one, I'm going to turn that into a third. So that should take up 4 columns across the screen. And let's see how that looks. All right, so that looks a little bit more cleaner. Now to really get more into spacing, we can even get into spacing more of these columns out. And you can add space between and space around, and I believe that's with like using flex direction, if I'm not mistaken. So that's one side of the grid that we can manipulate. And you see that underneath it, this section is still untouched. It's still containing 2 divs with an icon and some text. And we still have the footer at the bottom. Also, if we go and look at a different screen size, we can still see that this adjusts on a screen size. So I said that we would probably want to use flex direction or something along that line, but actually what we want to do is use some padding in order to create some space in between these divs, if that's the divs that we want to have here. So there is already some padding styling created for us and classes that we just need a reference. Mind you, we can make our own padding if this isn't sufficient or what we want. We would just need to create our own class and reference what that styling property would be. But I'm going to add this styling to my divs, and I'm actually going to do this one because I want styling on top, bottom, left, and right. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to the children divs. And then we're going to see how that looks. All right, so we have more space. One thing that I notice is that I don't have this left column centered, so it does look a little bit off. So I will go ahead and add the W3 center class to my div. And that should also make it look a little cleaner. Great. So I'm going to add some more customization to my div element. So I'm actually going to add just some images and move on to some media queries. So back in my style sheet, I'm going to add some GIFs at the bottom of my div. So I'm going to do an image element, and I have 3 different GIFs I'm going to use. And there's that whole debate going on. Is it GIF? Is it GIF? Apparently, you're right, no matter the way you pronounce it. GIF, GIF, you're right. Okay, so I have 3 of my GIFs at the bottom of my div. Now let's verify that these are actually showing up on the front. Awesome, and they are showing up, but the images are overlapping each other. If we bring up the DevTools and look at what it looks like on smaller screens, we see it's overlapping up until it gets to a certain size, and then it looks definitely how it should, but it's overlapping on a desktop screen, and that's because we need to make sure that we make our images or GIFs or GIFs responsive. So we need to add that styling to our image elements. So we need to add a class that is going to allow our images to be responsive. So W3 does have a image class that is going to allow those images to be responsive. And pretty much the properties for this is just going to be a max width of 100% and a height set to auto. So we can just incorporate this into our div, our images inside of the div. So it's just a quick copy and paste to add the class inside the element. And then I'm going to go ahead and save and see how this responds. Great. So you can see that our site adjusted with our GIFs now. And then if we do any type of resizing, the format adjusts properly. And like I mentioned, we're only using the styling that is coming from W3, but if we created our own styling, then all we would need to do is just come up with our own class names, and then we would just create the CSS styling to those class names and call them in. So now I would like to show you what we could do with media queries. So I'm still going to focus on the images that I've added to each of the divs. So what I'll do in my text editor is I'm going to just manipulate the image in the first div. So I'm going to actually give it a class of its own called hide me. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my style sheet so I can create the media query. And the style sheet is at the top and it came with the template. Normally your style sheet would be in a separate file, but the style sheet is in a different place somewhere else. It's not in our project. So I'm going to just add the style here in this same file, but normally you do have it in a separate file. So I'm going to say add media, and then I'm going to target the device type with screen, and then I'm going to add my expression, and I'm going to say media and the max width, I'm going to say 600 pixels, and then I'm going to start my condition, which is saying that the hide me class, I want it to display none. And remember, hide me is on our image that we created in that first div. So what this should do is that on screen sizes less than 600, the image in that first div should not display. But if it's higher than that, then it should be there. So let's see if that works. All right, so if we go into responsive mode, we can see that we only have 2 images showing up. That third one is not there because we are underneath 600. But if I expand this out, it comes back. Under 600, it's gone. Now, if we add that hide me to the rest of the images, then none of the images should be there on that screen size. So I'm going to go ahead and add hide me to the second div. And then I'll refresh my page, and we're only left with 1 image at the bottom. So just depending on maybe if you have certain things that should show on certain sizes, that's how you can manipulate that, where maybe images shouldn't be showing at all on mobile devices, that you'll target all the images and make sure that they're not showing if you're on a mobile phone. And with responsive design, you want to actually build with small devices first and then to expand out, because a lot of sites are built with responsive smaller screens first in mind and then expanding out to the larger screen. Especially when it comes to optimization and performance, that is usually the best way to do so. So hopefully you are getting more familiar and comfortable with responsive web design and why elements on your site move the way they move and the behavior and why sometimes things tend to be funky. And it's because us as the developers, we have to tell our website how to behave, when to behave, because it just doesn't know unless we tell it to do those things. So we have to incorporate those settings into our site. So the last thing that I just kind of wanted to talk about was at the top was our nav bar here, where that is also, of course, responsive, that if it's on smaller screen size, all the links disappear and turn into an actual drop down. So that is something that you can, of course, manipulate and play around with, where even sites like W3 Schools, they have two different nav bars, one at the top and one on the left-hand side. So they have some classes that we can use unless you want to create the classes yourself. But W3 sidebar is going to give us that sidebar if we want to have that instead. So if I add this class to my nav bar, dev class W3, we have bar right here. Let's just add sidebar to see what happens. And we don't need to touch the anchor links inside of it. And if we refresh, now our links are on the side, but unfortunately, it's starting to cut off into our content area. So that would mean that we would need to start manipulating these grids, the grid 1 and the grid 2, in order for that to not take up space, depending on what screen size we are on. Because of course, if it's a full screen, we can see what we need to, but that still doesn't look the best. So there's just more manipulation that we would want to incorporate if we want to have our nav bar on the left-hand side instead. And one last final thing you can do to get more familiar with the classes and what the properties are set to is just by taking a look at the style sheet. So I'm actually going to go into my page source and I'm going to actually go into the style sheet that W3 Schools created. I'm going to copy all of that and I'm going to go into my text editor. I'm going to create a new file and I'm going to name this styles.css. Inside of that file, I'm going to paste all of that code that I copied over. And here I can actually see all the classes and I can see all of the properties that all these classes are set to. If you like to, you can pretty much reference this style sheet instead of the style sheet here. And you can probably just play around with some of the code just to see how it responds on your website so you can be more familiar with these properties. All of these properties come from somewhere, they aren't made up, and you can find all these CSS properties through resources like Mozilla.org or W3 Schools, if I'm not mistaken, W3 Schools, outside of their own properties that they created, they'll give you the normal CSS properties that you can start learning on your own. So once again, hopefully this video was helpful with just touching on some responsive design methods and just a way to go about things when it comes to you laying out your website. And then once you get comfortable with W3 Schools, you can definitely challenge yourself to take on other templates and frameworks like Bootstrap, or even designing more of your own custom styling and layouts. So thank you for watching, and please tune in to some future videos.